Suicide of the West. An essay on the meaning and destiny of liberalism. James Burnham. Chapter 9, The Liberals' Order of Values.
As a rule, it is not the several values, ideals, goals, to which a man adheres that reveal most about his character and conduct, but rather the order of priority in which the values are arranged. It tells us little about John Doe to know that for him life is an important value. So it is for nearly all men, not quite all, but nearly all. But we will have learned much about John if we find out whether life is for him a value more important than any other, or, if not, what other value is more important than life. Better red than dead. Liberty or death? Death before dishonor. My life, that another may live. Suppose that we use the term liberty to designate national independence and self-government, the meaning that was presumably in Patrick Henry's mind, freedom, to designate the freedom, or liberties, of the individual, justice, to mean distributive justice of a more or less social welfare sort, that is, a reasonable amount of material well-being for everyone along with an absence of gross exploitation or discrimination, and peace, to signify the absence of large-scale warfare among major powers. Liberty, freedom and justice are the three primary social values or goals that have been approved or at least professed by nearly everybody, not quite everybody, but nearly everybody, in Western civilization, whatever the political philosophy or program, since the Renaissance. The fourth, peace, has moved into the front rank during the present century, especially since the advent of nuclear weapons. Most people want, or think they want, all four of these values, but, the way the world goes, it is not possible to realize the four equally on all occasions. One value must be subordinated or sacrificed to another, or others. Whether we wish to or not, each of us is compelled for practical purposes to arrange the four values in a certain hierarchy, if liberals will permit the word, or order of priority. For the older liberalism of the 19th century, the standard order, starting with the value that was regarded as the most important, was freedom, liberty, justice, peace. For 20th century liberalism up to a decade or so after the First World War, the order became justice, freedom, liberty, peace. From that time until after the Second World War, the last two tended to shift positions, so that the liberal ranking became justice, freedom, peace, liberty. Since the coming into being of full-scale nuclear systems, the standard liberal order has become peace, justice, freedom, liberty. This evolution expresses summarily the rise in the relative importance, for liberalism, of the ideas of social reform and the welfare state, and the gradual shift of stress from national sovereignty to internationalism. The significance of these ratings becomes more marked when we contrast them with non-liberal orders. For example, the form of contemporary self-styled conservatism that is really a kind of right-wing anarchism accepts an order that is the same as that of 19th-century liberalism, except for a displacement of peace. Freedom, peace, liberty, justice. However, this ideology, for this form of conservatism is also an ideology, grades the last three so much below the first that they must almost be thought of as belonging to a different scale, and it tends to interpret freedom primarily in terms of laissez-faire economics. The form of contemporary conservatism that might be called traditional, which is not an ideology, would not judge, or feel, that there is any fixed order of priority for the major social values. Under the specific circumstances of this specific time, it would probably rate the four here under consideration as liberty, freedom, peace, justice. For contemporary liberalism, then, the standard, typical or average order of priorities runs, peace, justice, freedom, liberty. Before discussing certain special features of this liberal order, I want to clarify what is involved more generally when several non-identical values are arranged in a priority sequence. My values function as guides to my judgment and conduct. I judge the worth of an act or line of action in their light, and I strive to realize them in practice. I strive, in fact, to realize all the values I hold, as fully as possible. Along with more personal values, pleasure, friendship, love, money, salvation, whatever they may be, I seek, as social or public values, peace and justice and freedom and liberty, all four. No critical problem arises so long as there is no conflict among the various values, but in the real world there is frequently both competition and conflict, and in many cases the conflict is insoluble in the sense that no matter what action I take I will have to negate and sacrifice at least one of the values. There cannot be peace in this situation, we find, unless the claims of liberty, i.e., national sovereignty and self-government, are diminished or neglected. There cannot be justice, for this minority group, perhaps, under the given circumstances, without restricting the freedom of some other group, or even of the majority. A liberal, or a conservative or a communist, may explain to me that these conflicts are only temporary and superficial. His values, he is confident, are consistent and supplementary. In the long run or the last analysis or somehow or other, he believes, raising every man's standard of living, justice, will guarantee peace and freedom too, or, if his ideological starting point is different, freedom, of the market, will prove the high road to justice, liberty and peace. So it may be in the world of ideologies or the earthly paradise, but in the real world the conflicts continue to exist, and to afflict us with the pangs of decision. I am not referring to choices between good and bad, right and wrong, justice and injustice, between, that is, white and black. In these there is no formal difficulty, the moral man knows that white is his proper choice, even when in his moment of weakness he opts for black. The painful decisions that concern us here are those between two or more courses of action along each of which some positive values will be realized and some will be sacrificed. In such circumstances we have got to establish, in practice even if unrecognized in theory, an order of relative importance among the different values. We have got to act as if some goods are better than others. Freedom to do business or to decline to do business with whomever one chooses is a genuine value, but this freedom, the liberal feels, is rightly sacrificed in order to end the correlated discrimination, injustice, to Negroes. Liberty must be ready, if the dilemma confronts us, to give way to peace. The actual problems can be intricate. It isn't always a direct choice between freedom, say, and justice, with one assigned an automatic priority over the other. Often it is a question, in both directions, of how much freedom are we willing to endanger or forego in order to achieve this particular enhancement of justice, or to increase the odds on peace at this particular juncture. There are not many individuals, though there are some, who always and invariably, under all circumstances, rate value A over value B. An absolute pacifist does, indeed, he rates peace not only over any other public value but over all others, and an anarchist so rates freedom. Perhaps that suggests the correct definition of extremist. But though most people arrange their values less rigidly, nearly everyone exhibits on average, whatever he may say, a recognizable and predictable order of preference. The laissez-faire economist or businessman is all for justice and peace and liberty, of course, but we know that when the practical choice must be made between any of these and freedom of the market, freedom is an odds-on favorite. When a man proclaims, "better red than dead," he is really saying that however much he may also want justice, freedom and liberty, he will always prefer peace if a choice must be made. I return then to the contemporary liberal order, peace, justice, freedom, liberty, and I direct attention, first, to the middle relationship, justice over freedom. I am sure that the rating, justice-freedom, holds for contemporary liberalism taken collectively, taken in its broadest sense as a social or historical tendency, and so taken, it is very broad indeed. But it does not hold for every individual liberal. There is a minority of liberals for whom freedom, individual freedom, especially freedom of speech and opinion, takes precedence, or seems to, over justice. Roger Baldwin, for so many decades the director of the American Civil Liberties Union, is no doubt one of the clearest examples. Not that Mr. Baldwin does not believe in social justice, universal welfare, social security, etc., and peace too, he would not be a liberal if he didn't, and no one would question his claim to the title. But if the issue came down to a choice between freedom and justice, as it does now and then, Mr. Baldwin would usually, I think, choose freedom, has, in fact, usually chosen freedom. I don't mean choose just for himself, that he would rather starve than submit to tyranny, and that sort of thing. My reference is to social and public values. I think that Mr. Baldwin would judge starvation better than submission to tyranny, if there were no way to escape from the dilemma, for human beings generally, for society, as well as for himself, or, to put the problem on a less extreme level, that he would choose a lower general standard of living plus more freedom as against a higher standard plus less freedom. There are other liberals of Mr. Baldwin's type. I imagine that Professors Henry S. Commager and Zechariah Chaffee are two, and quite possibly one or two of the members of the Supreme Court. But I have an idea that there are fewer of this type of liberal extant than there seem to be. This is one of the many cases in which the words men use are inaccurate tests of their real attitudes. Nearly all liberals, and most non-liberals also, for that matter, invoke the name of freedom the way a drill sergeant invokes his favorite obscenity. It takes closer study to find out just what they mean by that term and how they rate it under pressure. Very often we find that what is really being talked about has little to do with individual freedom, but is basically a question of advancing the interests of an economic, racial or religious group that the freedom invoker feels has a status below what it ought to be. Sometimes it is easy to prove that individual freedom is not really involved. For example, a liberal may call on freedom in demanding that trade unions should have the right to recruit members without interference, to strike, to enjoy immunity from anti-monopoly legislation, etc., and also to establish a closed shop, with automatic deduction of union dues from the paychecks of all workers. Without attempting to judge the merits of these two sets of proposals, it is obvious enough that by any normal understanding the second, that is, the compulsory closed shop and dues checkoff, is not an enhancement but a deprivation of individual freedom. This is accepted because of the belief that the enhanced social power of the unions taken as groups or collectivities will help raise the living standards and political power of the members. In this practical showdown, justice is preferred to freedom, a certain amount of individual freedom is sacrificed to the presumptive advance of social justice. And you will search a long time to find a liberal who will disagree with this specific choice, no matter how fervent are his usual hymns to freedom. Of course, if he is slick at words he will put together an elegant explanation of how the seeming curtailment of individual freedom in the particular instance, by improving the security and mobility and this and that of each worker and lessening his helplessness before the phalanx of monopoly capital, has the ultimate effect of increasing the worker's genuine individual freedom. But that sort of talk shifts us from the real world into the fantasy world of pure ideology, where anything goes and there's no point arguing. Let me stress, however, that I am not discussing here whether the liberal view on trade unionism is right or wrong, good or bad. I am only offering evidence for the conclusion that in the case of most liberals today, individual freedom has a lower priority than social justice. What we have come to call social security is another important and striking example. The United States, like most other Western nations and all communist nations, provides certain welfare services to all citizens through a system run by the central government and financed by compulsory payments from all wage earners. The exclusion, which always turns out to be temporary, of a few categories is irrelevant in principle, since both inclusion and exclusion are by group, not by individuals. Now whatever can be said for and against this sort of social security system, and there is a lot that can be said on both sides, it most certainly and unambiguously reduces at least some elements of individual freedom. Suppose I, an individual citizen, don't want governmental social security. Suppose I prefer to provide for illness and old age in my own way, or maybe just don't give a damn. My preference in the matter of course makes no difference. I must nevertheless pay my social security percentage, an always increasing percentage, it goes without saying, regularly, and my employer, too, if I have one, must pay for me. But don't most people, the great majority, prefer to have their social security handled through the centralized governmental system? Very probably, although they would quite possibly be just as satisfied with a decentralized, regulated system after the manner of our electric power system, such as is found in 1 or 2 European countries, but, certainly, the great majority like automatic social security. This supposititious have no objection. Let every man choose whatever system he wants, let it even be ruled that he must choose some system, so that he will not perchance become a public charge, thereby misusing his individual freedom to the injury of the freedom of others, only leave open an alternate choice for the deviants, doubtless a very small minority, who want to do it their own way. But no, the liberals' welfare state demands 100% compliance, with or without voluntary consent. Even the liberal achievement in making desegregated schooling the law, though not yet everywhere the practice, of the land cannot be called an unmixed victory for individual freedom. Let us grant the Supreme Court's finding in Brown v. Board of Education that compulsory segregation in the public schools violates not merely the rights of Negroes as a group but the freedom of Negroes as individuals, though it must continue to puzzle a naive observer that the court, in order to reach that conclusion in 1954, had not merely to amend but to contradict its own prior law and doctrine. Whatever the legal and constitutional niceties, it is plain to common sense that as a Negro I have more freedom if I can go to the school of my choice than if I must go to this school only, or, rather, to this particular type of school with respect to racial matters. The public school system allows no individual choice of school in any case. Nevertheless, this expanded freedom for the Negro is obtained only at the cost of a decreased freedom for white children and their parents. Within the framework of the public school system, and it is not excluded that the principle will become compulsory for private schools also, white students are not free to go to schools for whites only, though this might be their choice, or their parents' choice, if they were free to choose. Even the Negro families have lost one bit of freedom in payment for that which they have gained, for they too, where Brown v. Board of Education has effectively extended its sway, are no longer free to send their children to schools segregated by race, though some might wish to, conceivably even a majority here and there. In theory one might imagine families, white or black, wanting schools segregated by some other outlandish principle than color of the skin, color of the eyes, say, height, athletic prowess, ability at chess. According to the liberal principle in action, parents do not possess the freedom to decide what sort of school they want their children to be educated in, and yet that too is undoubtedly a freedom. Here, also, the other side of liberalism's freedom-stamped coin turns out to be coercion. It may be said more generally that the use of legal, police and other governmental sanctions to end social discriminations against racial, religious or other distinctive subgroups inevitably means some restriction on the individual freedom of some persons, perhaps of a majority or even of everyone. At the very least no one is any longer free to discriminate in the proscribed ways. This is by no means a mere quibble. In the United States, the spread and stricter enforcement of anti-discrimination laws and regulations, both state and federal, are progressively limiting my freedom to hire whom I choose, to decide whom to sell to or buy from, to associate with whom I please, to choose my neighbors, and so on, as well as to determine what sort of school I want my children to attend. It would be mere ideological hypocrisy to pretend that these are not genuine freedoms, moreover, of very considerable significance for the individual. Modern liberals, and a good many non-liberals also, believe, or assume, that the goal of ending social discriminations amply justifies the sacrifice of these freedoms, and perhaps it does, of course. In this field there is wide and daily confirmation of the fact that for modern liberalism's normal order of values, justice has priority over freedom. There is another complication in assessing the place of freedom in the modern liberals' litany. In the degree that we give freedom priority over other values, it gets closer to becoming, logically speaking, a universal. When it gets absolute priority, with all other values assigned not merely to a lower but a different order, then we have reached the pure ideology of anarchism. Short of that logical end point, the assignment of freedom to the top of the value list would mean that we want, more than anything else if not quite more than everything else, freedom for each, any and every individual, that our stand for freedom has nothing to do with the specific individual or type of individual in question. Men should be free, should enjoy so far as possible every concrete freedom, whether they are Tom, Dick or Harry, black, brown or white, Christian or Buddhist or pagan. If it turns out that our defense of freedom in practice favors these individuals but not those, this group but not that one, then we must conclude that it is not actually freedom that we are preferring but some other attribute pertaining to the individuals or groups that enlist our concern. Let me illustrate this abstract-sounding point. Suppose you observe that over a period of time I was frequently exercised over threats to the freedom of Christians, but seldom if ever over threats to the freedom of Jews. You would then be entitled to suspect that it was not just freedom, plain and simple, that I primarily valued. Or if I were easily aroused about invasions of the rights of employers but not of the rights of employees. Now I think it can readily be shown that most liberals, not all but most, exhibit a number of unbalances of this sort in their practical pursuit of freedom. Their sentiment toward violations of freedom is not an indiscriminate absolute, but rather, in Sir Arnold Lunn's phrase, a selective indignation. It is easier for a liberal to feel indignant at, even to notice, a presumptive violation of the freedom of a communist than of a Nazi, or of a suspected communist than of a suspected Nazi. Though a few liberal protests were put quietly on record, not many liberal tears were shed over the notably unliberal procedures of the government of Israel in the Eichmann affair. The mention of the trial of Sacco and Vanzetti can still rouse millions of liberals to fever pitch, but hardly anyone even remembers who Draza Mihailovich was, much less what his trial was about. Liberals the world over have lately been very impassioned indeed in defense of the freedom of Negroes to attend universities in the southern states of the United States, but few liberals have expended much feeling over, have even bothered to note, the daily and gross violations of the freedom of Christians in most communist countries, in several of which, as it happens, known members of Christian churches are not, generally speaking, permitted to enter universities. Angola's liberation from Portugal is demanded by 1,000 times more liberals than condemned India's armed conquest of Goa. Liberals everywhere, among them the President-to-be of the United States, bestirred themselves for years in support of the rights and freedoms of Algeria's Muslim revolutionaries, including the terrorist bands of the FLN, but the liberal dismay over the lost freedoms and rights of a million Christians of European origin, whose only home was and for generations had been Algeria, was too faint to be heard in the passing journalistic breeze. The patterned asymmetry of this selective indignation is related to a still more general and important trait of modern liberalism, to which I shall return in Chapter 11. But I have pointed to enough here, I think, to suggest that behind the shiny values that are the nominal goals of liberal conduct there may lie impulses, drives and interests that are not given open recognition in the official ideology. The relation between freedom and justice is the source of another of those dilemmas that are to be found within the structure of modern liberalism. Giving priority to one or the other can be thought of as defining two different kinds of liberal that are readily recognizable in the flesh, the older-fashioned kind, a dwindling tribe, that puts freedom first and is usually seen riding hell for leather on a civil liberties issue, the old-fashioned free speech, free assembly, academic and religious freedom sort of civil liberties, not the newfangled social, economic and UN Declaration brand, and the modernized liberals who feel most strongly about feeding the hungry, housing the homeless, and equalizing the unequal. This difference in human character type corresponds to a theoretical conflict within the ideology of modern liberalism, the conflict between the principles of free speech and the other individual freedoms on the one hand, and the principle of egalitarian social justice on the other. Essentially, it is a conflict between individualism and regimentation, the individualism that the liberal ideology derives from its past and the regimentation it has absorbed in the present. This conflict is real, and can be hidden but not solved by discussion, negotiation and compromise. It is a fact that liberalism's inherited principles presuppose individualism, and a highly atomistic individualism at that. It is equally a fact that the welfare state and plebiscitary democracy mean a good deal and an increasing deal of regimentation. One or the other must give way, and, on the evidence of the past generation, there is little doubt which is the tottering horn of that particular dilemma. In the classical liberalism of the 19th century, freedom was the unchallenged first among values, and this older ranking is retained, though somewhat blurred, in the tendency that is called liberalism on the European continent. The decline in the relative importance assigned to freedom and the correlated rise in the rank of social justice, reform and mass welfare quite evidently mark a major historical transformation. In Chapter 5 we examined the logical maneuvers by which this transformation was accomplished. Here we are concerned with the psychological and moral dimensions, with liberal sentiment, with the relative intensity of diverse liberal interests, with the ideals and goals that guide liberal conduct. The freedom that came first in the older liberalism included what I have been calling liberty, as well as individual freedoms. That is to say, the older liberalism did not sharply distinguish between freedom and liberty, the two terms were used interchangeably. The self-government and independence, self-determination, of nations and peoples was thought of as closely analogous to the freedom of individuals, and it was assumed, erroneously, as experience was to demonstrate, that they mutually promoted and supplemented each other. In the first section of this chapter 1 listed freedom and liberty, in that order, as the first two values in the older liberalism's order of priority. It might have been more accurate to list a compound freedom-liberty as first, followed by justice and peace. In accord with this value rating, the older liberals tended to be patriotic and nationalist. They believed in the self-government, independence and sovereignty of their own country, and also in the right of other nations and peoples to be independent and self-governing. They were ready to fight, and did fight, not merely to defend their own country but to advance its interests and influence, and many of them, as a whole series of romantic biographies attests, were eager to enlist in the battles for independence that were being fought by other nationalists in the Balkans, Italy and South America. There was little trace of pacifism in 19th-century liberalism, rather more imperialism than pacifism, indeed. As rationalists they believed that discussion, negotiation and democratic voting are the preferred methods for settling disputes, and that, other things being equal, peace among nations is better than war. But peace had a modest priority, there were a number of other things, liberty prominent among them, more important than peace. These attitudes of the older liberalism are partly reproduced in our day in the Afro-Asian anti-colonial, liberation movements, many of whose leaders became acquainted, through Western schooling, with the liberal doctrines, and introduced elements from liberalism, or at any rate from the liberal vocabulary, into their local political struggles. Moreover, the modern liberals of the advanced nations preserve the older attitudes and the older order of values with respect to the liberation movements in the underdeveloped regions. They proclaim the supreme right of each of the underdeveloped nations and peoples, even when the nations have never before had historic existence and the people have never formed a cohesive group, to self-government and independence at whatever political, economic and social cost, and they give practical support to the struggle to assert that right. And they are ready to accept fighting when that becomes the method of conducting the struggle. However, the emotional and moral as well as doctrinal relation of modern liberals to the advanced Western nations, and in particular to their own country if this is itself an advanced Western nation, has been transformed. In the first place, the concepts of individual freedom, what I have been designating simply as freedom, and national freedom, liberty, have been dissociated from each other. Both have been downgraded, but the second considerably more, and more unequivocally, than the first. Concomitantly, peace, which occupied a relatively lowly place in the 19th century, has rapidly risen until, for many liberals if not yet for modern liberalism collectively, it is now at the head of the list. Liberty, in the sense that I have assigned to it, means self-determination for the political or social group in question, the political group with which I primarily identify myself. For our grandfathers and their fathers and grandfathers before them, this group was in the first instance the nation, and in a more nebulous but still real sense, their, that is, Western, civilization, of which the particular nation was a part or member, and thus distinct in kind from nations that belonged to other civilizations. For the nation to have liberty, to be free, meant that it should be self-governing, independent and thus sovereign. For the civilization, it meant, or would have meant if the problem had been thought about along these lines, that Western civilization should preserve a distinctive character of its own, that it should not be, in whole or part, politically or spiritually subordinate to any other civilization, or non-civilization, that it should in fact be, or be regarded as, the highest form of civilization, properly ascendant over all others. To downgrade liberty means to dilute the idea of the sovereignty of the nation and of the uniqueness and superiority of the civilization, and to reduce the importance that we attach to these in the scheme of public values. In terms of attitude, it means, concretely, that patriotism plus Christian faith are to one or another extent replaced by internationalism, not just an international outlook that views world affairs in global terms, with due realization that under modern circumstances there is a multiplicity of interests besides those of our own nation and culture that must be taken into account, but an active internationalism in feeling as well as thought, for which fellow citizens tend to merge into. Humanity, sovereignty is judged an outmoded conception. My religion or no religion appears as a parochial variant of the universal ideas common to mankind, and the survival of mankind becomes more crucial than the survival of my country and my civilization. It is easy to see that, as liberty moves down the value scale, peace moves, in an almost automatic correlation, up. The big wars of recent centuries have been fought over the conflicting sovereign claims of the nations, mixed with clashes arising from religious and cultural differences. When nations and distinct civilizations are felt to be of lesser importance, big-scale wars cease to make sense. War has become, as we have frequently been told during the past decade, unthinkable. There is nothing left worth fighting big wars for. In the internationalized, or internationalizing, society, the resort to force becomes police action. In Chapter 5 we saw how the logic of the ideology of modern liberalism, its theory of human nature, its rationalism, its doctrines of free speech, democracy, and equality, leads to a weakening of attachment to groups less inclusive than mankind, to a conviction that democratic discussion, negotiation and compromise are the only proper methods for resolving conflicts, and to a trend toward international government. This does not mean that all modern liberals are unpatriotic, pacifists, and world government enthusiasts, though quite a number of them, and a growing number, are one or the other or all three. In particular, many liberals are pacifists. If we use the term broadly, to include moderate as well as absolute pacifists, it will cover a majority of liberals. However, it is not so much the terminal positions as the tendencies which the logic irresistibly determines. Liberalism has during the past several decades become less patriotic, in the old-fashioned sense, more pacifist, and more internationalist. Everybody knows this. It is shown publicly 1,000 times a day. These tendencies are a commonplace of modern argument and rhetoric. From the publication of Norman Engel's The Great Illusion 60 years ago, a geometrically expanding mountain of books, articles, speeches, charters, editorials and columns have explained that war between nations is out of date, nations themselves obsolete, universal disarmament mandatory, and growing international organization necessary to salvation. A political figure who suggests that peace may not be unqualifiedly the supreme object of national policy runs the risk of being scalped at sunrise by the leading hatchetmen of liberal journalism. In this post-war period it has required dozens of Canadian forests to sustain the output of books proving that sovereignty must go. In language provided for him by a staff that included several of liberalism's most accomplished ideologues, President Kennedy affirmed this strategy of peace, as his concluding phrase correctly named it, since the plan of action takes peace as the supreme value or goal, in his address of June 10, 1963, at American University in Washington.
I have, therefore, chosen this time and place to discuss the most important topic on earth, peace. I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary rational end of rational men. We have no more urgent task.
With strict logic the President added the necessary corollary respecting weaponry.
Our primary long-range interest in negotiating about arms control is general and complete disarmament.
His chief aide for policy planning, the liberal ideologue Walt Whitman Rostow, had included the third and completing link of the logical chain in the United States in the world arena.
It is a legitimate American national objective to see removed from all nations, including the United States, the right to use substantial military force to pursue their own interests. Since this residual right is the root of national sovereignty and the basis for the existence of an international arena of power, it is, therefore, an American interest to see an end of nationhood as it has been historically defined.
It is hard to be sure that the remarks of a political leader are not passing demagogy. This speech of the late president's may not state his own serious thinking, but it is no less significant as an expression of the liberal ideology that is the source of the speech's ideas and outlook, as of Mr. Rostow's books. Remarks like these that have just been quoted, which can be matched 1,000,000 times over, reveal that when modern liberals talk about peace and liberty they are dealing with ideological absolutes, not with the empirical facts of contemporary world affairs. In substance, they present a purely deductive theorem, like a theorem in a closed system of geometry, proving that the three absolutes, peace, disarmament and the end of nationhood, mutually imply each other. Though this last step is usually omitted by prudent ideologues, the end of nationhood is, in turn, equivalent to universal world government. Granted suitable definitions, this is valid enough as an abstract theorem, but it tells us nothing about the actual problems of the real world. Every informed person agrees that under contemporary circumstances national sovereignty must be modified and restricted. Indeed, every informed person, if he stops to think about it, knows that national sovereignty is in fact and always has been modified and restricted, that absolute sovereignty is a fiction that has never existed. Every nation, in charting its own course, has had to take into account, to one degree or another, the geography, resources, power and interests of its neighbors, and to temper or adapt its own sovereign claims accordingly. In our time, rapid communication and transport have made all nations neighbors of each other, and this fact as well as the existence of weapons of mass destructive potential must inevitably be allowed for in the practical exercise of sovereignty. Moreover, no sensible person, whatever his ideology if he has one, is going to suggest that under modern technological conditions a nation has the absolute sovereign right to make its own arbitrary decisions about the allocation of radio-TV channels, the rules of air and sea transport, the international control of epidemics, and so on. But the modifications and restrictions that these modern circumstances require do not inevitably mean the liquidation of sovereignty and the end of nationhood, any more than the acceptance of rules of the road taking into account the existence of heavy traffic means an end of driving your own car where you want to go. In fact, nationhood could achieve a richer meaning as the nation becomes more complexly and intimately related to the community of nations, somewhat as a man does not lose but rather enlarges his individuality through marriage and business and citizenship. The idea that nationhood, sovereignty, what in this chapter has been called liberty, must and should be adapted to changing circumstances is not, therefore, a belief peculiar to modern liberalism. What is distinctive is its view that nationhood and sovereignty should be not merely adapted and altered, but minimized or even altogether ended, and that liberty has become a lesser or even a negative value. I stress here not the logic of liberal doctrine, which we have seen leads to such conclusions, but the associated liberal feelings and attitudes that translate the doctrine into morality and conduct. The average liberal is just not so concerned about, not so emotionally involved in, nationhood, national patriotism, sovereignty and liberty as is a fellow citizen to his ideological right. It does not shock him when bearded young men say they will never fight for their country, nor is he indignant even when they express preference for a country other than their own. If a mob in an underdeveloped land smashes the consulate or embassy of his nation, he is not much aroused. Indeed, he may well conclude, after interpreting the facts, that justice was on the side of the rioters. He feels little thrill when the flag goes by, and quite probably finds pledges to the flag or oaths of allegiance actively distasteful. He approves many of the weighty books setting out to show the relativity and morality equivalence of diverse religions and cultures, and to decry the backwardness of those Westerners who still believe that in some rather important sense Western civilization is superior to Buddhism, Islam, communism, atheism and animism, and therefore worth preserving. If he is not himself a pacifist, as many of his fellow liberals are, he does not condemn pacifists or pacifist organizations. In fact, he usually praises what he calls their idealism, defends them against critics, and gives them smiles and cups of coffee when they picket his government's installations. He is likely to have an opinion more lenient than that of non-liberals concerning the deviations from earlier norms of patriotic citizenship by men like Robert Oppenheimer or Alger Hiss, particularly if their actions can appear to be motivated by humanitarian or universalist goals of a logical order higher than nationhood. It does not grieve him that his country should lose a colony or strategic base, or be humiliated by a vote in the United Nations. If his is an advanced nation of the West, he may rather rejoice thereat, as he may have contributed actively to the result, because it will seem a step toward the global justice and peace that he seeks. He will not feel uneasy, certainly not indignant, when, sitting in conference or conversation with citizens of countries other than his own, writers or scientists or aspiring politicians, perhaps, they rake his country and his civilization fore and aft with bitter words, he is as likely to join with them in the criticism as to protest it. It does not seem to him an anomaly that his own nation's communication industry should on a massive scale print the books, produce the plays and movies, present the television scripts of those who hate his nation and his civilization, and seek, often avowedly, the destruction of both. The cluster of attitudes and feelings which constitutes liberalism in the affective dimension is of decisive practical importance. It indicates what liberals will work and struggle, sacrifice and die for, and in what order. Many liberals, though not all, would reject as a slander and smear, the statement that they are not patriots, although they never themselves use the word except in a scornful phrase applied to war veterans, daughters of the American Revolution and Empire loyalists. But it is certainly a fact that the average liberal, for good or ill, is not a patriot in the sense of 50 years ago. That a man was a patriot meant that in political life his primary emotional involvement was with his country. Stephen Decatur was entirely accurate in his summing up of true patriotism. The patriot desires that his country shall always be in the right, but his country comes first even if it is not right. That is, in terms of the analysis we have used, for the patriot liberty is unequivocally first in the order of public values. But for the modern liberal, liberty is not first. If he judges his country wrong on a given issue, including the very important issues, he is willing that it shall lose out, he prefers that it lose out, he may even help make sure it loses. If the United Nations vote or the World Court decision goes against his country, then, he believes, the United Nations or the World Court should be upheld and his country give way. If he thinks that his country's weapons or strategy menace peace, then peace, he feels, not his country's military plans, should take precedence. It is the duty of his country to aid an underdeveloped nation even if that nation offers no reciprocal benefit, even if it is unfriendly or downright hostile. In other words, social justice, too, like peace, comes before liberty. There is nothing arbitrary in this pattern of liberal feeling or the conduct to which it normally leads. Liberals would be subjectively immoral, would be disloyal to their liberalism, if they did not feel and judge and act so. It may be that under sufficient pressure from reality these patterns of feeling, like the doctrinal syndrome to which they are linked, might crack up like spring-thawed ice, and that the older loyalties and ideas would force through the ideological crust. In the case of individual liberals this does undoubtedly continue to happen when the penetrating chip goes down. But for liberalism as a social tendency, the crust seems to be growing more rather than less solid in most of the advanced Western nations, and perhaps most of all in the United States. While the test ban and Sino-Soviet negotiations were simultaneously going on in Moscow during July 1963, a French liberal, Jean-Jacques Servan-Schreiber, editor of the weekly L'Express, summed up what is perhaps the decisive value issue, with traditional Cartesian rigor.
Henceforth, serious political leaders throughout the world divide into two distinct categories, those for whom peace is more important than all else, and those others who do not agree with that evaluation.
We may now assemble the main public values of modern liberalism, as made explicit in this chapter and implied in chapters 3 to 5, into the sketch of a kind of moral portrait of the typical modern liberal. In the case of each value, we may assume a corresponding sentiment, emotion, or impulse. And in order to provide a suitable background for the portrait of the liberal, I will place next to each liberal value the contrasting value from the cluster that defines a typical conservative of what I have called the traditional variety. These terms as I am here using them should not be taken in an absolute sense, however. As we have already noted, the liberals and conservatives within our civilization, except on their outer flanks, share most of the same values and sentiments, but in different degree, with different emphases and priorities. They exhibit different tendencies, not different natures. Still, these graded differences can be sufficiently decisive. 1. A liberal, as we have had several occasions to remark and as everyone knows, tends to welcome change, tends not merely to accept change that happens to come his way, but actively to foster innovation. If some liberals lack quite that passion for reform that Professor Shapiro attributes to them, they all do favor many and far-reaching reforms. They all feel responsible for doing something about the grave social problems that are never absent from the world we live in. They are prepared, in fact, if the reforms are slow in coming, to accept revolution, if the revolution in question or in prospect can be thought of as in some way popular, or democratic, and against reactionary forces. Nearly all liberals have looked kindly on, have often actively supported, at least in the early stages, all revolutions from the left that have occurred during this century, and there have been a lot of revolutions. This was as true in the case of the Russian Revolution of 1917 as of Castro's revolution in 1960, of the Algerian Arabs' revolt against France as of the Indonesians' revolt against the Netherlands. If a goodly percentage of these revolutions has gone sour, this does not in the least affect the true liberals' optimistic attitude toward the next one. The conservative, in contrast, tends to stress continuity rather than change, and what might be called renewal rather than reform, especially drastic and rapid reform, or revolution.
To be conservative,
Writes Professor Oakeshott,
is to prefer the familiar to the unknown, to prefer the tried to the untried, fact to mystery, the actual to the possible, the limited to the unbounded, the near to the distant, the sufficient to the superabundant, the convenient to the perfect, present laughter to utopian bliss.
Like all men, the conservative must suffer the inescapable changes that time inevitably brings, but, as Professor Oakeshott adds,
a man of this temperament will not himself be an ardent innovator.
2. The modern liberal tends to be egalitarian in sentiment, and to stress the ideal of equality among men with respect to their political, economic and social as well as legal rights, very broadly interpreted, and in increasing measure with respect to their conditions of life. He favors an active public policy, at all levels of government, to accomplish this equalizing. In recent years, he has been most intensely concerned, on a local, national and international scale, with equality among the different races of mankind. The conservative, while sharing the ideal of an equality of legal rights and agreeing on a goal of at least lessening the inequality of rights and privileges in other fields, prefers a more deliberate pace, and greater reliance on gradual shifts in community attitudes through education, experience and the indirect effects of modern economic structure rather than through the coercive intervention of government. And the conservative does not believe in equality in the abstract, in general, even though he may believe in this particular kind of equality under these particular conditions. He not only accepts but approves the hierarchical structure of society, with a large variety and range of stations and conditions. Some of the difference here is only in degree, no doubt, but of a degree sufficient to lead to wide divergence in many public fields from education to housing to tax policy, and in private conduct. Conservatives, some conservatives, may agree with liberals about, for example, the concept of equality in education that is expressed in the demand for racial integration of schools. But those conservatives will not feel as profoundly and passionately about it as the liberals, nor will they give the goal of school integration so total a precedence. The conservatives will restrict the means they employ to achieve such goals to discussion, gradual public education, and normal legislative or judicial action. You will not find many conservatives among the whites who join with Negroes in the picket lines, lie-downs and freedom marches of the recent mass movements proclaiming the goal of racial equality. 3. In economic matters interpreted in their broadest sense, the modern liberal tends toward such values as security, cooperation and collective welfare, the values, in short, that determine the conception of the welfare state. The conservative tends to stress opportunity and initiative more than cooperation, freedom of the marketplace more than security, and individual development more than collective welfare. Naturally, the conservative and liberal both assert that his way is the better route to both individual good and social good. The difference, as usual, is in the ordering. For the conservative, if individuals severally seek their own worldly, and heavenly, salvation, there will be the best chance that the good of society will also be most effectively promoted. For the liberal, if society, guided through government, assures the collective welfare, there will be the best chance that individuals will severally attain their happiness. 4. The modern liberal is internationalist in outlook. The conservative's attitude retains more of the traditional sort of national patriotism. There is no doubt that this is one of the most unmistakable differences between the two species, and one that has, moreover, repeated and extensive practical consequences. In our day, the attitude toward the United Nations as the most obvious expression of the internationalist trend is one of most accurate shibboleths. All liberals, from its beginning, have been favorably inclined toward the United Nations and hopeful about its potential, even when it has stumbled badly. Most conservatives, it is never possible to generalize too sweepingly about all conservatives, have been skeptical if not suspicious and downright hostile, even when it has scored an undoubted plus. 5. The liberal's internationalism is associated with a deeper attitude. He often thinks and feels in terms of humanity as a whole, of mankind. He worries about the survival of mankind, and recognizes a duty of mankind. The conservative, more localized in both thinking and sentiment, tends to feel that humanity is a bloodless abstraction, and that the prime social realities are not categories defined by abstract reason but the concretely bound and hierarchically arranged groups handed on by human history, family, community, church, country and, at the farthest remove, civilization. Not civilization in general but this historically specific civilization, the civilization of which I am a member. The conservative is likely to find a duty to mankind not so much non-binding as incomprehensible. 6. The modern liberal tends to judge peace to be the highest social value, higher than any other social value and, in the judgment of many liberals, higher than all others, and the supreme object of public policy. No conservative will judge peace higher than all other social values, and few will judge it higher than any other. And the conservative will place more stress, in theory and practice, than will the liberal on the strength, including preeminently the armed strength, of his country and its allies. The conservative drawn by these 6 core strokes must be regarded as a theoretical construct, introduced only to heighten the liberal values by contrast. And it should be added that the sketch of the modern liberal here outlined in the color of his primary values should be considered an ideological more than a psychological portrait. Innovation, reform, equality, cooperation, collective welfare, security, internationalism, the survival and betterment of mankind, peace, these are the values or ideals that characterize modern liberalism as a functioning tendency within our society. These are the values that accredited liberals profess. To the extent that affairs tread the liberal line, these values guide the steps that are actually taken, the programs that are pushed, the laws that are proposed or enacted, the policies domestic and foreign that are pursued. Not every individual who publicly professes or even follows the liberal line, however, has the same subjective relation to these values. He may vote in Congress, or advocate in his column or editorial page, egalitarian reforms for education or housing or whatnot, but he may be a dreadful snob in his personal life. The public champion of integrated schooling who would never dream of letting his own children attend an integrated school, and who would suffer a permanent trauma if his daughter sat at a soda fountain with a Negro, is a familiar enough figure in liberal society. Practical politicians can espouse liberalism for the best of all practical reasons without having any feeling about its beliefs and values one way or another.
A politician.
Pareto observes in a comment paralleling another I have earlier quoted from Robert Michaels, may be
inspired to champion the theory of a solidarity by an ambition to obtain money, power, distinctions. Analysis of that theory would reveal but scant trace of his motives, which are, after all, the motives of virtually all politicians, whether they preach white or black. First prominence would be held by principles that are effective in influencing others. If the politician were to say, believe in solidarity because if you do it means money for me, he would get many laughs and few votes.
On the other hand, there undoubtedly are many liberals whose subjective feelings correspond very closely to these professed and operational values, who really do feel the passion for reform, the sense of true equality with all their fellow men, the wish for universal cooperation, the desire to give everyone food and clothing and dignity, the duty to mankind, the burning hope for an end to war, who feel so, and who try to act in accord with those feelings. I attended a small, lengthy, and unrecorded conference in 1962 that discussed the problem of the theoretical foundation for the American foreign aid program. My assigned seat was next to a fine young man who was a friend and aide of President Kennedy's, assigned at that time chiefly to such matters as the foreign aid program, the Peace Corps and civil rights. I recall very vividly how at one point he declared with utter sincerity, his voice vibrating with emotion and his eyes shining.
So long as a single being anywhere in the universe
just so
suffers from hunger or any economic privation or any injustice, this nation has the duty to help him or her.
Or it, I suppose he should have added for grammatical completeness. But the diverse subjective feelings are primarily a private affair, of personal and some psychological interest. The public consequences flow from the public ideology, its correlated impulses, interests and social forces, and its implementing programs as these are translated into public program and external action, whether the individual liberals who proclaim the program and perform the actions are saints, villains, fools or hypocrites.